So the selection pressure is acting on a population, and the pressure is either causing individuals to die or individuals to survive, right? So if this selection pressure is causing mortality, individuals in the population are dying. Those that survive have some trait, right, that help them to survive in this environment. That makes sense to everybody, right? Everyone recalls talking about that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, is the role of the environment in this paper acting in the same way? Or when these authors talk about the environment, you guys, here, is it different?
It differs only in the amount of response to how much plasticity each species can generate in order to adapt to the environment. So eventually, some of the species would die off based depending on the environment. Whereas what basically the reason I got the selection pressure from was the ones that were in the harsher environment with less sunlight did better in both environments, full sunlight and less sunlight. Whereas the ones with full sunlight had less ability to become plastic in the less sunlight.
Okay, so you have a more sunlight treatment and a less sunlight treatment. And you said that individuals that were raised here could live in both.
Had less plasticity in both environments.
And these guys did better?
Yes.
Okay.
It is correct.
Hmm?
It is correct.
Are you asking me if it's correct?
Yeah.
I think I trust that Jason understands it. Yeah. Do you understand why that response is happening? So which of these environments do you think is more stressful for the plant? Having very little sunlight or a lot of sunlight?
I feel like they're both equally stressful.
They could be. Too much sunlight is stressful. Let's just think about it as like kind of moderate sunlight then. Okay.
I think the way they describe it is full sunlight or just like covered.
Shade.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll think of this as the happy condition, and we'll think of this as the sad condition. Okay? So if you're a plant and you're growing in very low sunlight, options are you can die or you adapt. Okay, so if you have the ability to adapt, you will. And so what researchers are finding is that some plants have this ability to be plastic. They can grow in such a way that they'll be able to survive those conditions. And what are some of the traits that we see? Plants, what are plants doing in low sunlight?
Bigger leaves.
Bigger leaves, right? It's maximizing the area for photosynthesis. So now, if you're growing up in full sunlight, you really don't need to adapt, right? You kind of just chill, you're good, okay? Now, when you take these individuals and you put them, that lineage, and you put them in full sunlight, this is like cushy life, right? I mean, they're good. They're used to ghetto conditions there. And so, you know, you give them whatever, you give them the basic necessities here and they're good, right? They're fine. If you put these guys who are used to a cushy life in the ghetto, then they just die and will like cry.
Like they kind of become lazy, kind of. I guess.
Sure, yeah. Their perspective has changed, right? They have third world or first world problems. Yes.
So this is on the micro level, right? Not so much macro level.
Yeah, macro level means that you're like getting, you know, this is macro evolution is on the scale of phyla. Like all of a sudden you have a new phylum, or you have a new kingdom, or something like that. Micro is talking about, okay, you look like a plant, you know, and you're able to adjust some certain traits So yeah, still talking about micro.
This paper's all in Minecraft, right?
Yeah, the example is it has implications for macroevolution. So that's that last question there. But for right now, we're talking about microevolution. Now, when you're thinking about this genotype now, an individual that has a genotype that's adapted to low sunlight, and you put it in full sunlight, what does it do?
Stars.
So you've got big leaves here,
Yeah. Just some genes are different.
and what happens when you put that genotype here? It has
Leaves
smaller
different.
leaves, right?
It's gonna produce less leaves. Yeah.
Or fewer leaves, sure. What's the role of the environment now? Is this environment acting as a selection pressure on this individual?
It's causing change.
It is causing change.
On the
Is it the same
phenotype.
sort of change as what we talked about when we talked about environments acting on a population?
Because when you're talking about acting on population, then you're each, I guess, let's say this, there are differences in the population. Each individual stays the same. While in this case, the individual is the same, but like they're reacting differently for the stress.
Right. So in this paper, when they're talking about plasticity, the environment is changing an individual, not the population. So there are two things going on. The population is changing in the sense that this plasticity is evolving. It is a population thing that's subject to natural selection. But when you physically take this individual who's grown up in low sunlight, this genome, and you put it into the full light situation, and it changes its phenotype, that's a different environmental effect, right? The environment is no longer, say, a selection pressure on a population level. The environment is somehow interacting with the genes.
Would it be a pressure if the plant didn't have the ability to do that? Do plants generally have?
Probably. So, like, when you put this guy in there, he doesn't change, right? He'll just die. And so in that case, there is no plasticity going on, so the point that I'm making doesn't matter. But if you imagine growing up this line of plants, you have clones, and you take that genotype, it's an embryo, you grow it up in these conditions, it doesn't look like the other ones that grew up here, but it's the same genes. Yeah.
So, in short, that would be wrong because the environmental effects kind of emphasize or express the genotype into how the phenotypes are expressed.
Right. In this case, in the plasticity, we're talking about environments interacting with the genes.
So it wouldn't be noise there.
No. It would be relevant.
Yeah.
And that's the point that they're making in the intro. That's something that scientists didn't realize before. They were thinking, okay, yeah, the environment affects the phenotype, but we really want the genotype. But what's happening here, this author is making the point that even though the genotype isn't changing, the environment is interacting with that genotype in an evolutionarily relevant way. It's changing the phenotype, and that's what selection sees, is the phenotype. So this is a different perspective on the environment that we've talked about before. Okay. So what we've done before is we've laid kind of the basic groundwork. What are the traditional mechanisms that Darwin talked about, the modern synthesis talked about, and now what we're doing is we're exploring new mechanisms of evolutionary change. So plasticity is new because it's acting on the gene level. So if that's not quite clear, it's okay. We'll discuss two and it will become clearer. kind of experiment might we design to try to tease apart the effects of genes in the environment on phenotype?
Is that a question? Isn't that what they're doing?